If you enjoy history as much as I do, there's a 93% chance you've never been in a romantic relationship, which is a good thing, as showing affection to another person, especially a woman, is fucking yucky, and an upside to avoiding romance is avoiding all the toxicity that comes along with it. And today, I wish to dive into what is, without a doubt, the most toxic relationship in history, the marriage between Edward of Carnarvon and his insignificant other, Isabella of France. Edward of Carnarvon was born to King Edward I. He had the typical upbringing of an English prince. He learned Latin, learned how to ride horses, and according to later sources, that was a fucking bar, learned how to ride men. And it was quite obviously the king that the young prince wouldn't be able to live up to his standards. And to be honest, not many people would have. Edward I is considered amongst one of the greatest kings of England. The man was brutal, but also an absolute beast of a warrior. He won the Second Barons' War when he was a prince himself. He conquered the Welsh, and even subdued the Scots for a short time. Meanwhile, his son was just a fucking poofter. However, he was still his son, making him a useful piece on the chessboard. Edward I, who was having the typical disputes with the French crown, came to an arrangement with the French king Philip IV in 1299. He agreed that his 15-year-old son would in future marry the French princess, Isabella of France, who was only 4 years old at the time, and in 1303, they were formally betrothed when Prince Edward was 19 and Isabella was 8. However, the marriage won't take place for another good few years, so allow me to continue talking shit about Prince Edward. When Edward was 16 years old, his father would place a young noble within his service, a man by the name of Piers Gaveston, and some sources like to portray the two as homosexual lovers. Why? Because Edward II really liked Piers. As the two grew up, Edward would spoil Piers with lavish gifts, and was said to favour him above the rest of his noble companions. And in 1306, now both in their 20s, they would be knighted at the Feast of the Swans, alongside a few hundred other nobles. These included Roger Mortimer, and also Hugh Despenser the Younger. Remember them, they will definitely come into play later. Unrelated to this video, the Feast of the Swans is also featured in the movie Outlaw King, and it's perhaps my favourite scene in the movie.
By these swans, I vow to avenge this murderous insult to God!
And as the year went on, Prince Edward would constantly spoil Piers with lavish gifts to the extreme anger of his father. He was so angry, in fact, a 14th century source would claim the king grabbed his son by his scruff, bet the brakes off of him, and then said, "I'd rather have a man who digs ditches as the king of England than you little rat bastard. You like having Piers pierced through your bumhole, yeah?" Okay, he didn't say the last part. And he made a choice to exile Piers from England to keep him the fuck away from his son. Piers would go into exile briefly, but only a few months later, Edward I would die of dysentery while campaigning in Scotland, and apparently on his deathbed, he told his nobles to keep Piers from returning to England, but they would fail. Edward II would inherit the kingdom and its problems at just 23 years old, and now, while he probably should have concentrated on, defeating the Scottish, Edward II lacked the same military prowess of his father, but a trait he possessed that his father didn't was being a clingy fucking gay boy, as he quickly annulled Gaveston's exile, and Piers was reunited with his true love. Reunited and it feels so good. And if bringing him back to England wasn't bad enough, Edward decided to make Piers the fucking Earl of Cornwall. More like Earl of Cornhole, am I right, guys? Come on, that's a good joke. I'm proud of myself for writing that one. Let's give me a little pat on the back, right? Yeah. This title was typically held by men of high status or of royal birth. Piers was just a minor knight, so this favour towards him began to anger and alienate the rest of Edward's nobles. Hey lad, hey, aren't you supposed to marry some French wench? What's the question? Oh fuck, I forgot. Now let's get into the beginning of his marriage with Isabella. In 1308, the two were about to wed, but there was one obvious problem with the marriage. That's right, Isabella was French. Yucky. Oh, and I guess the 11-year age difference is a bit fucked as well. Anyway, the two would marry in France, and afterwards sail back to Dover. And who was waiting for them at Dover to land? Piers Gaveston, alongside England's finest nobles. Now typically, the king was supposed to show favour to his queen, but nope, as Edward landed, he reportedly ran straight to Piers at the pier, and threw his arms around him, and hung on like a leech. Sorry. Oh, hi, I'm Isabella, it's nice to meet you. Get your own fucking man! And according to some sources, Edward showered Piers with kisses and warm embraces, and openly called Piers his brother. So he was a fan of incest too, it seems. I'm gonna say now, a lot of these stories are probably overblown to portray Edward as homosexual, and while it's not 100% confirmed he was gay, I like to portray him as such, because it's so much fun, Jan, get it? And after their wedding, A coronation was meant to be held at Westminster Abbey, and during the ceremony, the crown of St. Edward was meant to be brought to the altar by the Earl of Lancaster, whom was Edward's cousin, so a bishop might take it from the altar and place it on Edward's dumb fucking head. But instead of the Earl of Lancaster bringing the crown to the altar, it was of course Piers Gaveston. A monk who wished to remain anonymous stated that it's disgusting that the sacred crown of England is being carried by the filthy hands of Piers Gaveston. Bosh! The English nobles were disgusted and backed Edward into a corner to demand Piers be re-exiled. Edward was like, What's the question? Exile? Yeah, we don't talk about it till Tuesday, you guys. Give me a couple days in the war room and I'll see what I can do. And Edward decided he hadn't made a big enough fool of himself or his wife yet, because after the ceremony, Edward would hold a feast for the French and English nobles, but instead of having the walls showcasing their Plantagenet lines beside the fleur-de-lis, he had a coat of arms of Gaveston displayed beside his instead. But that's just something minor. What else could he have done to anger the French and his wife? Well, instead of sitting beside his wife, he fucking sat Piers beside him at the high table, and Piers was also said to be dressed in purple. His colour was meant for royalty only, and they spent the entire feast huddled up together, whispering, laughing, and feeding each other mouth to mouth like birds. Okay, I made the last part up. But he might as well fucking done that, because Isabella's family members, specifically her uncles, were disgusted at how she was being treated and sidelined. Oui, look at those faggots. How could this get any worse? Isabel, I'm so sorry you go through this, but your uncle and I bought this beautiful pendant just for you. Oui. Hey, that just made my day. Thank you, uncle. Oh shit, that's shiny as fuck. Give me that. Hey, Pierce, look what I won from the baccarat table from Steiny. Hey, catch. Yep. Edward even took the gifts and dowry that were meant for Isabella and gave them to Piers instead. The uncles were beyond disgusted and stormed out of the feast to speak with Philip IV. Oui, did you know you married your daughter to a fucking retard? Oh, yeah, nah, not really, but we'll see what we can do about this Piers fella, eh? Philip began secretly supporting, and at times funding, nobles who hated Edward and Piers. And by the way, Piers being favoured wasn't the only reason nobles hated him. They also hated him because he was a fucking cunt, and was noted to give some, in my opinion, fucking hilarious insulting nicknames. For example, Aymer de Valence, the Earl of Pembroke, he would nickname Joseph the Jew. His brother-in-law, Gilbert the Clear, he would nickname the Whore's Son. Edward's cousin, Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster, he would nickname the Fiddler. Not someone that fiddled kids, but someone that played the fiddle. The Earl of Lincoln, he'd nickname First Belly, because he looked like fucking Tai Tuivasa. And perhaps his most famous nickname, he would give the Guy de Beauchamp, the Black Dog of Arden, which he gave him due to his fiery temper. But in my opinion, this nickname is fucking cool. Why would you be mad at it? And Guy, hearing this nickname for the first time, was quoted to have said, "If he call me a dog, be sure that I will bite him as soon as I shall perceive my opportunity." And he would eventually, in 1308, the English nobles utilized the doctrine of capacities to limit Edward's power. Now, I'm not going to go into exactly what this doctrine was about, because I'm too retarded to explain it, but they used this doctrine to say to Edward, yo, either exile Piers or we will rebel. So Edward would exile Piers to Ireland. Ireland mentioned, yeah. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury would get involved, stating that if Piers were to step foot in England again, he would excommunicate him. But his exile wouldn't last long. Edward II began bribing his unhappy nobles, and even petitioned to Pope Clement V to have him revoke the threat of excommunication. He was successful, and only 1 year later, Piers would return. Reunited and it feels so good. Meanwhile, Isabella, who was still a teenager, was doing her best to navigate the situation. While she probably disliked Piers, she was also said to play the dutiful wife during these times. And when Piers returned, you would assume he would learn his lesson and gain some humility. But nope, he went back to his old ways, insulting powerful nobles. Boy, are you fat. Boy, are you black. So it wouldn't take long for the English nobles to take action once again. In 1310, they would march on Edward and basically strip him of much of his power. He was no longer able to appoint his own commanders without permission, nor make war without the permission of Parliament. But most importantly, he was to exile Piers for life. And if Piers returned, he would be sentenced to death. Edward was forced to accept these terms, and Piers would flee to Flanders. But not surprisingly, he returned around 2 months later and met up with Edward in the north of England, which basically caused a civil war. And it's around this time, Edward would finally bone his wife instead of his bum boy. In February, the two would fuck, and Isabella would get pregnant. And after conceiving the child, Edward would leave to help out Piers. He would hide Piers at Scarborough Castle, whilst he would go and raise his army. But while he was away, the castle would be sieged by Joseph the Jew, the Earl of Pembroke, and Piers lacking the provisions for a siege, surrendered under the terms that he would not be harmed. Pembroke would agree, and the two began their travel, but Pembroke, who wanted to visit his wife, would leave Piers at a rectory, and in this brief moment, the Black Dog of Arden would break in with his armed guards and seized Piers. "Hey lad, hey, I fucking knew it. Joseph the Jew betrayed me, didn't he?" And he forced him on a mule to Warwick Castle, where many of the discontented nobles formed up as a jury, and here they quickly judged Piers guilty of treason and sentenced him to death. But there was one problem. None of them wanted to be the man to slay Piers himself, fearing the potential wrath of Edward and the stain they would leave upon their honours. So they did the brave, honourable deed of hiring 2 Welshmen to stab Piers with swords, and then chop his head off. Nice. They then left his remains there to rot, but soon later, a Dominican friar would sew Piers's head back on. "Is it finished yet?" "Oh, ye? Yes, your grace." "I swear upon these 2 swans, I will avenge the murder by those treacherous bastards." "My, where the fuck did you get those?" "Get the fuck out of here, kid. Allow me some alone time." "Piers, you still look sexy as fuck." Even though he was devastated by the death of Piers, there was something for him to celebrate. His wife Isabella would give birth to their first child, one Edward of Windsor, who would later become Edward III, and around this time they would have somewhat of an affectionate relationship. But Edward would still need something to take his mind off Piers's death, and what better way to suppress your feelings than warfare? He would march against Robert the Bruce, and was absolutely fucked at the Battle of Bannockburn. Nice. Due to this defeat, Thomas of Lancaster would use this opportunity to seize even more power, and was practically the regent of England, whilst Edward was his puppet. But even though Edward was a shit king, Lancaster was quite a shit regent, and in 1317 the two would raise armies, and England was on the brink of civil war. But thankfully, England's bishops would intervene, and the two would sign the Treaty of Leek, where Lancaster would give up most of his power, and instead a council would be formed to ensure Edward didn't abuse his, and as part of this deal, the council would appoint their own royal chamberlain to Edward, a man by the name of Hugh Despenser the Younger. Now they chose Hugh because his history with Edward was not positive. The two were said to have disliked each other, but it wasn't long before the two had hot, toxic, steamy sex together as well. Hugh probably noticed that Edward was quite lonely and needed a new favourite to confide in, so he would cozy up to Edward, and of course, many speculated that the two were gay lovers. Hugh quickly began influencing or outright manipulating the king, and while Piers Gaveston was a massive cunt who wanted titles, probably to inflate his ego, Hugh was just fucking 5 times worse, and wanted a lot more power, and convinced Edward to seize titles and lands in Wales to hand it over to him. One of these titles was the Lordship of Gower, or some shit, and the seizure would spark what's known as the Despenser Wars. Many nobles began to rebel against Edward and Hugh. One of these men was Roger Mortimer, who began raiding through Wales and captured lands that Hugh owned. They eventually marched on London, where Edward II was having a mental breakdown, and forced him to exile both Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder. They weren't creative for their names back then. Hugh and his father would leave England and decided to go on a little side quest, pirating. They would begin raiding merchant ships to continue gaining their riches. Edward was depressed, having no person to fuck. What about me? I mean, no man to fuck, and he desperately wanted his little Pookie back. And it's here, Edward would finally fucking man up and lace in his bootstraps. "Roger Mortimer, you need to come back and fight somebody, so fight me!" He raised his army, but needed a just cause for a fight, so he sent Isabella to Leeds Castle. This castle was under the control of rebel Bartholomew de Baldsmere, and Edward fully knew that Bartholomew was hostile to him. The Queen would ask for entry, but Bartholomew's wife, Margaret, who was in the city, would refuse, and even ordered her garrison to loosen arrows at the Queen. By the way, I'm not sure if Isabella wanted to do this herself or she did it for Edward, but it doesn't matter, because Edward had all the cause he needed. He would march to Leeds with his army, captured it, and hanged the governor. Yeah. And then marched Margaret to London Tower and imprisoned her, and she would be the first woman to be imprisoned in the Tower of London, which is a huge milestone to feminists like myself. Next, he recalled the Despensers and made his move on Roger Mortimer. Mortimer, realizing he was fucked, surrendered to Edward in the month of January 1322, and he was also thrown in the Tower of London, but only 1 year later he would escape and fled to France. Next, a royalist knight by the name of Sir Andrew Harclay decided to move on the Earl of Lancaster and the Earl of Hereford, and was able to defeat them at the Battle of Burrows Bridge, I don't fucking know. The Earl of Hereford was slain in battle. However, the king's cousin, the Earl of Lancaster, was captured alive, and he was brought before Edward and the Despensers, given a swift trial, sentenced to death, and then beheaded. This would basically end the war. Hugh would continue to seize and export lands, and by now, he was probably the richest subject in England. But Hugh would make quite a mistake. While Piers Gaveston was never noted to have been cruel or ill towards Isabella, Hugh, quite a cunt to her. During a little campaign in Scotland, Isabella joined her husband and Hugh, and was left a Tynemouth rectory, or some shit, whilst her husband and Hugh would continue. However, the Scots would launch a counter-invasion, forcing Edward to retreat. Without his wife, Isabella was forced to escape by ship, and during her escape, 2 of her ladies-in-waiting would die. Isabella was pissed, and blamed Hugh entirely for convincing her husband to abandon her. But that wasn't all. A brief war would break out in Gascony over the lands England held in France, and the King of France, Isabella's brother, Charles IV, would seize most of Gascony. Hugh would then convince Edward to seize Isabella's possessions and estates, claiming her, being French, was a risk. Based. He then imprisoned much of her staff, and even had her sister-in-law spy on her constantly. By now, Isabella fucking hated Hugh. She had been made a fool long enough. But luckily, this diplomatic fuckery, sidebar, would grant her a great opportunity. Edward II wished to go to France to negotiate with Charles IV, but Hugh refused, suggesting that he send Isabella instead, believing her to be mentally broken and easy to control. Isabella then sailed to France, and when she landed, she intended on never returning to her husband unless Hugh was removed. And here, she would basically mastermind a great strategic move. Charles IV demanded that Edward II go to France to swear homage if he wished to retain his lands. Edward II would send envoys but never go himself. Charles would deny all the envoys, giving Isabella quite the idea. Instead of Edward II coming to pay homage, her 13-year-old son, Prince Edward of Windsor, should come instead and swear homage himself. Charles would agree, as did Edward, and Edward handed over the heir of England to Isabella and her brother. Isabella, now having the heir to the kingdom, had all the leverage she needed, and now she could publicly state that she would never return to England or her husband's bed unless Hugh was removed from England. In a dramatic move, she stood before the French courts, dressed in all black, to resemble a widow, over dramatic much, and stated, "I feel that marriage is a bond between man and woman, but someone has come between my lord and me to break that bond. I protest, I will not return until this intruder is removed, for I am in great danger from him," which is quite the crafty move. She kept the appearance of a somewhat loyal wife. She wasn't blaming her husband, but was blaming Hugh, who usurped her place beside the king. But she wasn't all too loyal, because remember how Roger Mortimer fled to France? Well, he would join Isabella's inner circle, and soon began fucking her. And they made no secret hiding it. At a ceremony, Roger Mortimer was said to have dressed in Edward's uniform. Which doesn't sound like a big deal now, but back then, you might as well fucked her before the courts. Edward II was furious, and would write some letters to his wife. Here's some. "You have drawn to you Roger Mortimer, and you keep his company, both within doors and without, in public and in private. We are heavily displeased that you should behave so unnaturally against your marriage vows and your duty to us. You pretend that you do not return to us, for fear and doubt of Hugh Despenser, but we marvel at this, for you have welcomed and comforted our notorious enemy, a man banished and convicted of treason, who plots our destruction. We command you, by the fate and love you owe us, and on our royal blessing, that you leave the company of Mortimer and all of our enemies, and return to us with all speed. If you do not, we shall take such measures that all the world will know of your disobedience." He then demanded that Charles IV return her and her son, but Charles would reply, "The Queen has come of her own will, and may freely return if she wishes so, but if she prefers to remain in these parts, she is my sister, and I will not expel her." The situation was quite fucked for the young prince. He was basically a hostage to his mother, and by all means, political pawn. And by now, Isabella's intentions went from wishing for Hugh to be exiled, to invading England for Roger, and forcibly removing Hugh. But to do that, she would need an army, so she went to her cousin, Joan, the Countess of Hainault, and betrothed Prince Edward to her cousin's daughter, Philippa of Hainault, in exchange for 700 soldiers, as well as 140 ships to sail back with. When Edward II heard of this arrangement, he wrote to the prince, "We command you strictly," okay, I'll stop, "upon your allegiance and your blessing, that you do not contract any marriage, nor give your consent to any alliance without our direct command and permission. Return to us without delay, for your absence is a heavy burden to our realm." And a few months later, he would write his final letter to Edward. "Edward, sweet son, you know how heavily we bear your absence, and how much we desire your presence. We have written to you many times, commanding you on your loyalty and your blessing to return to us. yet you remain there, lending your name and your person to those who wish to strip us of our royal power. Understand clearly, fair son, that if you do not return to us, you act against God, against the Holy Church, and against your own father. Do not let yourself be a shield for traitors who seek to ruin our house. We pray to you, come to us in all haste, before it's too late. Now, I make no secret that I don't like Edward II, but these messages truly saddened me, as Prince Edward genuinely loved his father, and was disgusted at his mother's adultery, and by all means, he genuinely wished to return to his father. And return he shall. With his mother and Roger Mortimer, they would set sail for Orwell. Isabella would bring an extra few hundred mercenaries, and landed with 1,500 men. Whilst this meagre force wouldn't stand a chance against the kings, the nobility and commoners quickly rushed to their side, viewing them as liberators against the tyrannical king and the dispensers. Edward and Hugh would flee to Wales, hoping to raise an army, but many did not want to fight for them. Meanwhile, Isabella would march on Bristol, where Hugh the Elder was staying, and besiege the city. The citizens, who fucking hated the Elder, opened the city gates, and Isabella would capture him and instantly put him on trial for treason, had him sentenced to death, and then had him hanged and beheaded, and then send his head to Winchester to be stuck on a spear, and his body was hanged again for display, till it was taken down so he can be cut up, with his remains being fed to dogs. Yeah! She then set out for the younger and her husband, placing a £2,000 bounty on them, which today is worth millions. Henry of Lancaster, the brother of Thomas who was executed, led the search party in Wales and captured the two men. Edward was treated with some respect, but was imprisoned, whereas the younger had a brutal fate in store for him. He had a crown of nettles placed on his head, and was dragged by a mule to Hereford, and when he arrived, he was hanged at the gallows, but just before he could suffocate to death, he was cut down, brought on top of a ladder, and the executioner would cut off his genitals and threw them in a pile of hot coals, while Hugh was still watching. This was to symbolize his punishment for committing sodomy and destroying the royal marriage of Isabella and Edward. Isabella committed adultery, by the way. He then cut open his torso and pulled out his bowels and his heart and threw them into the fire. This was to symbolize the burning of evil counsel he held within his heart, or some shit. These people were fucking sick. And now when finally dead, they took his body down, had it beheaded, and quartered. And by the way, Isabella forced her 14-year-old son Edward to be front row and present for this brutal execution. Trust me, I had a lot of sympathy for Isabella at the beginning, but Edward III is my fucking goat, so fuck her. She then had his head mounted on a spike, with the rest of his limbs being sent to Dover, York, Bristol, and Newcastle. Yeah, Isabella was known as a she-wolf of France for a good reason. But she wasn't done yet. She still needed to remove her husband from power, so she and Roger can rule instead. In January, the English nobles voted to depose Edward II and wished to crown the 14-year-old Prince Edward as Edward III. However, the teenage boy would burst violently into tears and refused, shouting through his tears that he would never accept the crown and betray his father unless his father himself permitted it. I fucking love you, Dad. Forcing Isabella to go to her husband to demand his abdication. Edward II, who was nothing more than a biodegradable banana peel, first wept and then fainted, but when he was awoken, he stated that he was truly sorry that his subjects hated him this much, and he would abdicate. The prince, hearing of his father's abdication, would reluctantly accept with guilt, and he was crowned king at 14 years old. However, he was only a king in name. He held no real power. Roger and Isabella would rule as the regents, and he was their puppet. Edward II would live in captivity for a few more months, but eventually died of mysterious circumstances, almost certainly murdered, most likely smothered by a pillar, or starved to death. But the most famous story of his death is that two knights held him down, whilst a common soldier inserted a red-hot poker up his anus to kill him, though this is almost 100% not true, and is a story told to make fun of Edward's sexuality. Now, I could end my video here, as Edward II is out of the picture. However, Roger and Isabella are still alive, and any chance I get to glaze Edward III, I take. So let me tell you how the young king would eventually get his revenge while he was still a teenager. While Edward was surrounded by Mortimer loyalists, he was able to secretly gather 24 knights that were loyal to him. One of these men was a man by the name of William Montague, and they would make their way to Nottingham, where Roger was staying. However, the castle was heavily fortified, but luckily for them, the constable of the castle, William Elland, was extremely loyal to the young king, and would lead them through a secret tunnel, known today as Mortimer's Hole. This tunnel would lead into the castle's courtyard, and once inside, they made their way to Roger's chambers, and sprung their attack in the halls, killing Roger's men. They then bursted into Roger's chambers, where he was hiding alongside Isabella. Roger was tackled to the ground and restrained. Isabella then threw herself before his son and said, "Fair son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer." "Fuck you, bitch." Roger was quickly led to London Tower, the same place he escaped years before. "Hey, you come here often?" He then had Parliament condemn Roger to death. Roger was stripped naked, then Marshal Tyburn and hanged on November 29th, 1330. And another reason why I love Edward III is that he was also able to forgive Mortimer's family. He refused to punish his widow and even made Roger's son the Baron of March. And when the son died, Edward would take Roger Mortimer's grandson under his wing. The 17-year-old boy would fight alongside Edward at Crecy and was even made a Knight of the Garter. Okay, I went a bit off course for glazing Edward III, but I fucking love him. He was quite the warrior, capable of brutality when needed, but also upholds the image of chivalry a medieval king should. And with that final section of dick sucking, that ends my video on the most toxic relationship in history. If you want a video where I spend the entire time glazing Edward III, or want me to kill myself, leave a comment below. Anyway, sláinte.